Walter, I won't keep you long. And folks, Walter's coming up right away. Okay, I'm going to break in here because I want to give everybody an update real quick. We are at the $862 mark with our fundraiser. We are trying to raise $20,000, or in this case on the screen, you see $20,200 for the 2020. We got to use that 2020 to our advantage somehow, right? So we're trying to raise $20,000. That's our annual budget. That's 3/4 of that is our rent, just to keep us in the location that we're at, a great location in right near downtown Austin, east of I-35 here in Austin, Texas. We're trying to get Patty, you see her glowing there in blue, Patty, the Bigfoot, up into the saucer there to reach that 20,000 goal. So big news here. We have been contacted by an anonymous donor who wishes to remain anonymous. We are personally aware of this person and can vouch for them, and we're honored to be issuing you all a challenge grant of $5,000. If you can help us reach $5,000, we can double that to $10,000, and we will be halfway there. So again, big news. There's a challenge grant in effect for the total amount of $5,000. So if you can help us get to that 5,000 mark, we can double that and have $10,000 halfway to our goal. So without further ado, I want to bring on somebody who has been a very intriguing fellow to follow all these years. He is one of a couple of presenters who I'm lucky to have become aware of through the mutual friend of Greg Bishop. And I am speaking, of course, of this afternoon's guest, Walter Bosley. I'm going to bring Walter on here. Hey, Walter, how are you doing? Oh, sorry. There we go. Unmuting. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Do you hear me well?
I hear you well.
Okay. I have this button for muting on this headset that I just found. These aren't my headsets. Someone loaned them to me. And I was hoping I hadn't touched it in picking up the headphones. So you can hear me. That's good.
All right. Yes, I can. Walter, I'm going to not cut into any more of your time, but if you know about Walter, former AFAC and FBI intelligence counterterrorism. I'm probably fudging that, getting it all wrong, but he's an author and researcher on a number of subjects that go into a variety of interesting areas that I think our listeners will want to hear more about. So I'm going to go ahead and get off the line here and let you get started.
Okay. All right. Looking forward to it. This will be fun. So hello, everyone. For those who don't know me, yes, I'm Walter Bosley. I spent 19 and a half years in the national security community of the United States. Started out as a CI specialist with the FBI, then earned a commission in the United States Air Force, and spent my entire time on active duty as a special agent of the Air Force OSI. And then I went into counterterrorism, working in a global venue, did a lot of travel during those years. I also established a publishing company back in 2002, started out as a pulp and classic adventure fiction publisher. But by 2008, I had gone into nonfiction. It's not a vanity press label. I have published 5 or 6 other authors as well as myself. You can't find my books on Amazon. Amazon is not good for independent publishers. So you can find my stuff at lulu.com. And I'm the publisher. They're just a printer distributor. And I'll talk again about where you can get the books later. Also, I have a blog that I am occasionally very active on, but sometimes there's periods where there's not much stuff, but there's good stuff there, and that is empireofthewheel.blogspot.com. That's empireofthewheel.blogspot.com. Okay. And also I have the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube, and every Sunday I do a live stream, and in between then I'll do movie analyses and things like that. So that's where you can find me, roughly who I am. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, and that is Charles Dellschau, the Sonora Aero Club, and breakaway groups through that filter, you could say. And my speculative hypothesis on who today would be part of this, what I think was an historical breakaway civilization. So I'll jump right into it. Let me get my notes here. They're handy. And Charles Dellschau, who was he? Well, he's known to most people as an outsider artist when you look him up. A lot of people that's all they consider him, an outsider artist who made up a bunch of stuff about this mystery group in California in the 1800s, and that's where it ends. What he did to that extent was to create numerous volumes of really intriguing art of what he claimed were flying machines that were, again, created by this mysterious group in California. In California in the 1850s. Now, Dellschau himself was a German immigrant who came into the United States through, I believe it was Galveston, Texas. He came in through Texas, and that's where he was living at the beginning of what he claims was this interesting little episode that led him to this mystery group in California. And that's where he spent the rest of his life after that period of time. And this mystery group in California that he claimed was building flying machines was called the Sonora Aero Club. Now, Dellschau himself, in his own journals as I said, there were several books of his artwork, but he also had this journal in which he tells this story of being assigned by this mysterious group that he called NYMZA, NYMZA, and that's in all caps. He claims this NYMZA group, which had its headquarters in Germany, had tasked him to go to California to look in on and report back about the activities of one of their sponsor groups, a group that they allegedly sponsored, according to Dellschau, called the Sonora Aero Club. Now, the Sonora Aero Club was a group of German immigrants who, again, Dellschau claims, was building flying machines in the 1850s. Now, this is, over 50 years or around 50 years before the Wright brothers, flew at Kitty Hawk, which is often recognized as the first, the beginning of the era of controlled flight, other than balloons. The idea that anyone was building flying machines other than balloons as early as the 1850s is generally written off as fantasy. And not for bad reason. It's because we don't really have examples. We just have stories, right? So this is what's intriguing about this story about the Sonora Aero Club, okay, is because it was a half a century prior to the Wright brothers. And what's more is Dellschau claimed that they were using anti-gravity. Now, in Dellschau's works, and I'm going to show you this really great book. This is really the best book that you can find on Dellschau's art, and you can find it through the Stephen Romano Gallery. And it's this book here, The Art of Dellschau, and that's an example of one of his flying machines. Now, he claims that this man, one of the German immigrants, the leader of the Sonora Aero Club, Peter Menace, held the secret, okay, to this anti-gravity technology. And the real secret was this liquid. I don't know if you'd call it a fuel, but it was this liquid that was part of the important part, the most important part of a chemical process, which allowed these things called arrows, AERO, to fly using essentially anti-gravity. Remember, this is in the 1850s. I'll show you an example of some of Dellschau's other. There's an example of one of his schematics. Now, by the way, he did these works of art between 1893, I believe, and 1923 when he died. And they were discovered in a junk store and a trash heap in 1971 by a man named Pete Navarro. There we have some more. See, these are the schematics of the flying machines, anti-gravity flying machines that Charles Dellschau claimed that the Sonora Aero Club was building. And again, I show you this book because it's really the best example of Dellschau's art that you can find, in a book out there. And again, that's from the Romano Gallery. And there's something very important in there that I'm going to show you in that book here momentarily. So this group of these German immigrants with, interestingly, Italian immigrant farmers and ranchers specifically, who were allowing the Sonora Aero Club to work on and pretty much kind of hide their flying machines in their barns up in now Sonora, by the way. Sonora, California is up by Yosemite. It's just west of Yosemite in what's called Tuolumne County in the gold country. It's where Columbia and Jamestown, and if you've ever seen the TV series The Big Valley, they would shoot scenes in old Jamestown because there was an old town area and there's the old Western era train and all that. If you've ever been to this area, again, west of Yosemite, that's where we're talking about, okay? And old Columbia up there still has, I believe, the oldest grass runway airport, small aircraft private airport in California, if not the Western US. And what's interesting is this airport is in the location that 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, Dellschau claimed was the secret area that the Sonora Aero Club would fly their arrows. It's interesting that the local community airport would subsequently be built in this same area, tucked in against the hills. And again, the Italian ranchers were allowing the Sonora Aero Club to use their barns as kind of hangars, secret hangars. And this was all, again, done secretly. It was just something they were doing privately. And Dellschau claims that they were backed up by this German organization called NYMZA. And, but there was a rift. The German immigrants, they kind of liked being in America, particularly California, because back in the 1850s, it was almost a free-for-all. You could be away from everything. And specifically, the members of the Sonora Aero Club wanted to be away from the East Coast and big cities and such because they wanted to get away from prying eyes. And there was some drama. They did not like NYMZA. NYMZA at one point, according to Dellschau, sent a gentleman, an inspector from their organization, whom Dellschau and the Sonora Aero Club referred to as that Prussian officer. And they did not like him because essentially NYMZA wanted the Sonora Aero Club to develop arrows with arms on them, with weapons to be used for war, if need be. And the men of the Sonora Aero Club, Peter Menace in particular, did not like this idea, didn't care for that at all. And so they were definitely opposed to that idea, and thus began the rift. And it wasn't long after that we are told by Dellschau that there was an accident and Peter Menace was killed. And this resulted in pretty much, we are told by Dellschau, the disbanding of this Sonora Aero Club, and that's it. It's done. They disappear, no more. about their amazing flying machines and the technology that Dellschau claimed they used. Well, I found this to be really interesting, and when I started pulling threads, I found that they might not have completely have disappeared, at least their technology. And I found threads connecting possibly to the 1890s airship mystery. And I definitely found more threads leading to what this group NYMZA could have been, who they could have been, leading right up into the World War II era in Germany. And so it appears that they didn't really disappear. But there are problems with this story, with Dellschau's story, and that is The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells, published in 1901. Now, remember I said that Dellschau did his books between 1893 and 1923, 1923 being the year he died. We only really know that for sure, that he started them in 1893 based on what he tells us. Dellschau and his works are really the only source we have on Dellschau. And this has to be acknowledged. A lot of times in this field that we're interested in, a lot of times people want something to be true so much that they're not willing to acknowledge the problems with certain hypotheses. And I like to be very honest. In my books, I tell people up front when I'm speculating. I make that clear. I go out of my way to make that clear. I also very much try to remind people that, you know, anything that I extrapolate from when I'm pulling threads, when I'm hypothesizing, I like to tell you it's a hypothesis. And the Dellschau story that I just kind of ran through for you is very intriguing. And my personal position is there's definitely something to it. I don't personally think that Dellschau was just an outsider artist, but I have to acknowledge, you know, whatever problem might arise with his story, and one of them is this H.G. Wells novel, First Men in the Moon. It was made into a film in the early 60s. I recommend it. It's one of the films that Ray Harryhausen and Charles Schneer produced that doesn't get as much attention because the focus in this movie is not on the stop motion creatures, although there are stop motion creatures in this film, but it's actually one of the better Harryhausen films, and it's basically about these two men and a woman who in the 1890s travel to the moon in a craft, the spherical craft designed by this Mr. Cavor, okay? And it just so happens that he's developed this liquid stuff called cavorite. And by painting the craft with cavorite, he renders it capable of anti-gravity. Now, this does indeed sound like the stuff that Dellschau claims was Peter Menace's secret to the anti-gravity, this mysterious green called soup, spelled S-U-P-E. But that's what Dellschau claims Menace used. I mentioned it earlier, the active ingredient in this chemical process. Well, here we have this H.G. Wells story from 1901, which kind of has the same thing in cavorite. Okay, now, what's more is there was a writer named Robert Cromie who claimed that Wells plagiarized his story titled Plunge into Space, which uses the same kind of thing, anti-gravity stuff, and you know, there's a journey to the moon, the whole thing. There are several points from First Men in the Moon that are kind of just right out of Plunge into Space. And Cromie's story was published in 1890. The reason I bring this up is again, Dellschau's writings date from 1893 to 1923. Now here we have this Cromie story published in 1890. So we have to acknowledge that Dellschau could have read this story and made up the whole idea of soup. Or at the very least, he could have in 1901 read Wells's First Men in the Moon and based soup on cavorite. So we have to acknowledge that possibility. In all fairness, though, to Dellschau, we must also acknowledge that perhaps Cromie and then Wells had heard rumors about Peter Menace and the Sonora Aero Club and their soup. So the fiction writers could have drawn it from rumors of the guys who were actually doing it. Thing is, we don't know. We just have to acknowledge that it's out there. But before we go too far into discrediting Dellschau and his story, there's a kind of a little major inconvenience. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the Nazi bell. Okay, now that was the bell-shaped object with the counter-rotating cylinders inside, inside of which they would pump a special mercury solution. Now, see, there's that idea of a special liquid solution, in this case, a mercury solution called Zerum 225 or 252, something like that. And but it was a special liquid, right? Now, this goes back to Dellschau using soup. He would use a special liquid in his chemical process to make these arrows capable of anti-gravity flight, according to Dellschau. And we know the rumors of the Nazi bell claim that the thing was capable of anti-gravity levitation and propulsion. And there are theories that it was developed for just that. And of course, it goes into the whole Nazi saucer legend. What does this have to do with Dellschau? I'll show you. This is something that I and Stephen Romano discovered. This is a page from Charles Dellschau's diary. Now, remember, this diary was written before 1923, the year he died. And as you can see, right there, see that picture right there? That is a bell-shaped generator cone over a central axis, and it rotates. That's the operative mechanism, okay, that Dellschau claimed that Peter Menace had in all of the arrows that achieved anti-gravity flight in the 1850s. Now, I wanted to show you that it's an actual page from Dellschau's journal, and it predates his death, 1923, and we're told that the Nazis weren't working on the bell until, you know, the World War II era, just prior to it. And I'll show you a little easier here in this one. This is in my book, Origin, which again is available at Lulu. Okay. And there you can see it again. There's the bell. And there's, you can see that Dellschau referred to this as the generator cone. Okay. Now, over here, we have other versions of it that Dellschau claimed Peter Menace had. Every arrow had this, a rotating cylinder. That was what dripped the mystery fluid soup onto the rotating cylinder. Okay. And in this, the bell-shaped one, the generator cone, this is wild trying to do this opposite of, the liquid would also be inside through the central axis and the rotation of this. Now, this essentially, folks, is the Nazi bell, a prototype, a proof of concept version. But, folks, that is the Nazi bell prototype. Dellschau's claiming dating back to the 1850s. And Dellschau himself claimed prior to 1923, which is the decade before we are told the Nazis were working on their bell. So you have to ask, you know, wait a minute, what did Dellschau know? Well, the common thread there are the Germans. Remember, Dellschau himself was a German immigrant, And the Sonora Aero Club, Peter Menace, these were German immigrants to the United States. And NYMZA, despite what a lot of people think NYMZA was a New York-based organization merely because the NY, and there was talk during the Airship mystery of New York investors, but that was kind of a red herring. It was very misleading. Dellschau himself, the original source of NYMZA, tells us that NYMZA was based in Germany. So you have a German secretive organization, and you have the German immigrants over here using this secret technology that they've developed, and essentially is the bell. And then 75, 80 years later, you have Nazi Germany allegedly doing this thing called the bell, which is a much more advanced version of the thing that Menace was doing in the 1850s. Now, you might ask, what exactly was NYMZA? Well, we don't know, other than what Dellschau tells us, that it was this German organization that was backing these mystery groups. By the way, the Sonora Aero Club wasn't the only one, but this German organization was backing these mystery groups, and that were all developing flying machines, okay, or various other arcane technologies. But I decided to try and figure out what NYMZA could have been, and what I came up with was a rough translation of NYMZA, and an attempt, this is all speculative, this is my hypothesis, an attempt to identify what this NYMZA would have been based on what we know of Dellschau and the other threads that I subsequently pulled. And the way I describe them is, NYMZA is a distinctly Prussian nationalist organization dedicated to a unified Germany's global superiority in active pursuit of influence and exploitation of the natural resources and industry of the Americas. What does this mean to someone who doesn't understand the history of Germany? We didn't have a unified Germany until the 1870s, okay? At the time of the Sonora Aero Club and this NYMZA of Dellschau, Germany did, as we know it, did not exist. There were like 40-some independent states, and the Prussian, so over there, you know, the Prussian states and the Prussian culture over there, they were the ones that were the driving force behind a unified Germany. And NYMZA was probably, in my opinion, an organization that was within that effort. That's why you have all this stuff about, you know, a unified Germany. Now, when you break down the other things in there, for instance, the pursuit of influence, that's a biggie, and it becomes a bigger one in the 20th century. Exploitation of the natural resources and industry of the Americas. This was something that, going back to the Junkers days, okay, in medieval Germany, this is something that the Germans were actively doing, the Prussians more specifically, and that is they were in the Americas, particularly South America, and they were looking for sources of gold. Now, when they unified under Germany, they would, you know, establish a gold standard for their nation's currency and such. And that's your exploitation of natural resources. And this is partially, in my opinion, what NYMZA was out there looking for, but also industry. Now, one thing that they would do, and this is what I was getting at, is they had discovered a way to invade an area of the world or a given nation, and that was to transplant their industrial interests. In other words, put German folks running a German industry, be it mining or what have you, in a given territory that they would want to take over. Okay, and they would go in and they would do that, get themselves rooted, and then that's where the influence comes in. That's where they would begin to influence politicians or whoever, and then they would get their hooks into this particular place, nation, state, what have you. And, you know, if they could take over through their influence and control from behind the scenes, that's what they would do. Now, that's history. That's not speculation or hypothesis. This was even done by the Nazis, okay, when they came into power. So this was a thing that they would do, and that's that's how I see, NYMZA and how they operate. Now, in my opinion, you had this thread of Germans who, because of what the NYMZA agents likely were able to glean from what they knew of the Sonora Aero Club and Peter Menace and the soup and this rotation generator cone thing, they had this information, okay, for 70 years before the Nazis used it. It is my hypothesis that this NYMZA group, which I think was an organization behind or inclusive of many of these German occultist industrialists that were certainly around during the 19th century and the late 19th century going into the 20th century. I don't think that the Nazis got their bell from extraterrestrials, aliens, or the Vril Society contacting such people from other worlds. I think what it was is these industrialist occultists of NYMZA knew enough or found out enough about the soup and the things that Menace was doing, that this is where the Nazi scientists got or were fed the idea of doing an advanced version of Peter Menace's generator cone. And the Nazis, of course, called it the bell. So again, going back to Dellschau, what do you do with that? I mean, essentially the bell appears in Dellschau's work before the Nazis ever did it. Now, the problem with the idea of the bell, okay, and the Nazis even doing the bell, and some people do have a problem with it, is that the Nazi saucer lore is often connected with the bell technology. They say that, well, they got the bell from aliens who gave them the idea for these flying saucers, or they got the idea of the bell from the aliens, or a crashed saucer that they had captured, a crashed extraterrestrial saucer, and they reverse engineer it. They got the bell, and then they start creating their own saucers. Okay, there's a big problem with that, and that is that the Nazi lore, well, it is saucy, maybe in some cases. The Nazi saucer lore is really, unfortunately, BS. It's actually the product of a guy named Ernst Zundel, and he came up with all this Nazi saucer and the extraterrestrials and the captured saucer after World War II. You go and you look, you cannot find legitimate sources of this prior to World War II. Now, people today argue that, oh no, there's all this stuff. It's not true. It's not true. It's unfortunately one of those things that gets assumed to be true. Okay. Unfortunately, as we know, a lot of that goes on in our field and in our community, but it's not true. The Nazi saucer lore, it only dates back to post-World War II propaganda and stuff, starting with this Ernst Zundel guy. Another problem is now Igor Wachowski was the first guy to write about the bell. Then, of course, Nick Cook wrote about it, and Joseph Farrell's written about it. And Wachowski, who I think was an honest guy himself, his source claimed that there was a connection, with the bell technology and the idea for it from the Samrangana Sutradhara. Now, that book is popularly credited all the time as being this 2,000-year-old text that talks about Vimanas and the Mercury vortex engine, essentially bell technology. Well, the fact is the Samrangana Sutradhara is not 2,000 years old. It only dates back to 1924. Okay. And now it claims to be, or people claim it to be, an encyclopedia of what's in ancient texts. But, that unfortunately is kind of questionable. Another problem we have with what Wachowski's source, a Polish intel officer, by the way, is that Walter Gerlach, the German scientist most connected with the bell, himself wrote an article about the transmutation of other, stuff into gold. Okay, and this is one of the things that Wachowski's source said they were fooling with. Now, what's interesting is Gerlach's article also dates to 1924. So you have this Samarangana Sutradhara dates back to the same year as a Gerlach article in which he talks about one of the things that Wachowski's source on the Bell claims the Germans were doing in relation to all this Bell research. The problem there that we have to acknowledge is, number one, the Nazi saucer lore isn't true. Number two is that Wachowski's source could have been saying anything, because at the time, Wachowski cites the source, the Polish officer, at the time they were willing to say anything to be accepted by the Allies and not, be put on trial or condemned or executed or whatever. And I argue that this Polish officer who claims to have, witnessed or know stuff about the Bell or read stuff about the Bell, I think it's very possible that he was familiar with this Samarangana Sutradhara book and the Gerlach article and kind of, put those things together and might have made up what he was saying based on that. The fact that we've got the Ernst Zundel stuff, which is, proves the saucer lore story is Nazi saucer lore story is not true. And, these other articles, it's just like with Dellschau and the Wells and the Cromie story. You have to acknowledge that these things are there prior to, someone making their claims. Now, I would then in turn argue that the problem with the Nazi Bell thing not being true, if you're going to argue that, is Kecksburg, the Kecksburg, Pennsylvania UFO. The witnesses and the drawing you have of that, it looks just like the Bell. And Joseph Farrell has done some lengthy analysis of that to show you that the Kecksburg, Pennsylvania UFO was probably something our Department of Defense was developing from the captured Bell technology. So what we've got is, strong reason to question the Bell story, while at the same time, strong reason to say, well, there's got to be something to it, right? And the truth is probably somewhere in between what people want to believe and what people want to naysay. So, anyway, that's where a look at Dellschau leads, and I don't want to go over my time, so I gotta, in the interest of moving along, I'm gonna jump to the topic of the breakaways. Now, the whole breakaway civilization thing, that's a phrase that Richard Dolan came up with, and in a pretty good definition. I would change it to society, because civilization, that word implies too much, something bigger, and people have really run amok with, the civilization part of that. I call it a society, but essentially breakaway civilization, or society as I call it, is a group of people who have the resources and means to not be subject to the civilizational structure that the rest of us are. Okay, I think that's the best description of it. Now, this idea, you could go back, to the Sonora Aero Club, and you could say, well, did they become a breakaway? They might have. But of course, they were associated with NYMZA, according to Dellschau. And NYMZA, in my opinion, is, it qualifies to be one of these breakaways. Now, there is another possibility that goes, it has its connections to the 1890s airship mystery. And I think this starts with something that I call, hypothetically, the Aeron Project, starting with Solomon Andrews, who demonstrated a non-balloon flying machine to, let me find what I did with the picture here, to members of Abraham Lincoln's War Department during the Civil War. Okay, and that's this right here. Now, this was not a balloon. It looks like it, but it was not a balloon, and he controlled the flight. Okay, and we are told that Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War of the United States back then, we are told that he said, well, the war's almost over and this isn't practical. Thanks, but no thanks. Well, I present a hypothesis in my book, Secret Missions 3, Destination Carcosa, that actually the U.S. government did not write it off. And after the war, they started what essentially was the first American black project. I call it the Aeron Project. Andrews, the picture I showed you, called his device the Aeron, A-E-R-O-N. Now remember, this was in the 1860s, just the decade after the Sonora Aero Club out in California. And Solomon Andrews' flying machine was suspiciously like the Aero Club, the Sonora Aero Club. So it's possible that Andrews was acquainted with former members of the Sonora Aero Club, or perhaps a Peter Menace who had faked his death to get away from the NYMZA. Now, what does this have to do with the 1890s airship mystery? Well, that happened 30 years after the Civil War. Now, if you take Solomon Andrews Aeron, okay, you add 30 years of technical development to that, and you could have the airships of the 1890s as they're described. Okay, so what would that make the group building those airships seen all over the United States in the 1890s? Well, in my opinion, it would make them an American group. Now, there were those who appeared to be not typical Americans among, you know, some of the crewmen that were witnessed, but there were by name identified these two guys here, Samuel Tillman and Amos Dole. Now, when you read the 1890 accounts in the paper and they're talking about these two guys, okay, you think, well, those are just two names. We don't know that they existed. Well, yes, they did. There they are right there. Tillman was a U.S. Army officer. Dole was a scientist. So in my opinion, that suggests that the airship mystery vehicles were an American-based effort. And from that, I have hypothesized, this is getting into heavy speculation, I have hypothesized a group that I call the 1903. And the reason I call them the 1903 is simply because there is one of those rumors and legends that in 1903, Nikola Tesla had designed one of his, he designed an airship, and allegedly this group took a secret trip to Mars. Now, Castile and Schwartz say that they got this info from the late Jim Keith, who claimed he heard about this from a source. And allegedly they flew this airship to Mars, and that's all we know. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know if they made it. It's all a big mystery. I talk about it in my books. It's been talked about elsewhere. And it's my opinion, my highly speculative hypothetical opinion, that this group that would have done this in 1903 was probably the same group of people responsible for the 1890s airship mystery over the United States. And I just refer to them as the 1903 because it's just an easy marker, you know, to show you the connection. But again, it's hypothetical. And in the meantime, the NYMZA group was out there too, doing their thing, I think, in South America. And I get into that in this book that I showed you that you can find at Lulu. Get into the details on that. Now, what are the problems with that? I have to acknowledge, problems with that. And the main one is, if these groups exist, where are they? Okay, particularly where's the 1903? You know, there was World War II, World War I and World War II after this. If these machines existed, how come we weren't seeing them in those two major wars? That's a major problem for this particular theory. Sort of, okay? The fact is, NYMZA, in my opinion, was the force behind the rise of the Nazi Party. Okay, and I go into that in my book. To me, it's obvious when you go in and you look at the possible people that could have been running an organization like NYMZA, as Dellschau describes it and as the threads suggest. You find German occultists and industrialists in these are the same guys that you find associated with the rise of Nazi Germany. So the question is, where are they now? Well, in my opinion, NYMZA just kind of embedded itself in the whole post-war Nazi issue. And they came into the United States through Operation Paperclip, in my opinion. Now, remember what I told you that the Prussians were doing from the medieval times all the way up to the 19th century, their little sneaky way of invading. What would they do? They would embed themselves in industry, right? And involved with exploiting the resources. Well, that's exactly what Paperclip was. Okay, it was scientific industry, yes, but more specifically, what was the result of Operation Paperclip in the United States? That is our post-World War II military-industrial complex. In history, not speculation, shows you that German scientists and technicians of Operation Paperclip were right there, you know, among the people who developed our military industrial complex. That, in my opinion, is where you will find NYMZA guys embedded in the official, you know, United States national security structure. Unfortunately, to put it mildly, this essentially NYMZA and the Nazis used Operation Paperclip, okay, to transplant their invasion. Germany was defeated, but their idea goes on, their NYMZA/Nazi thing goes on, and they just figured, okay, the United States wants our technical guys. This is how we can get inside there. All right. And yeah, that's a major problem. But that's my opinion. I think that's where NYMZA is. They're all over the world. They are what Joseph Farrell likes to call a Nazi international. And that, you know, that's my opinion on that and where NYMZA is today. Now, where's the 1903? I have my ideas. They're very thin, but you know, it is a question. Where are they? Where would they be if they existed? So that's we got to, you know, that's kind of the problem we have with that. But now I wanted to address the underground, you know, the subterranean stuff. You know, the idea of people living in subterranean civilizations goes back to ancient times and including the Native Americans. There is my dad's story in which he claimed to have been briefed in on what Roswell was. This is the book about my dad's story, Shimmering Light. He had told me this tale from 1974 about encountering these people that had gone underground thousands of years ago. The problem with that, and I did an honest investigation of my dad's story, is that my dad was in the very command and section of the U.S. Air Force that also was developing their own MK Ultra program. Okay, and my dad was directly involved with the early U.S. Air Force Mercury program before NASA took it over. So you've got the Air Force fooling with MK Ultra, you got them developing a space program, you've got the Cold War. It's my opinion that this crazy story my dad tells about the underground and the people could have been an MK Ultra false narrative label laid into his psyche because he had worked on something classified. But that doesn't mean there isn't you know, a presence underground, because if you read the works of Richard Sauter, he tells you about the history of the bases and underground structures that have been built since the 1950s. God knows how advanced they are today, how big they are. And that is another place where the breakaway groups, they have the resources. They could make their own underground facilities and installations. So as you can see, this is this huge mire of a milieu, okay? It starts at first with Dellschau. You look and you go, can this be true? I mean, maybe those people that say he's just an outsider artist are right and he was making it all up. But then you have the problem of these other threads that I've laid out for you. So, you know, that's a lot that I've thrown at you. My books, again, the one about my dad here, if you're interested in that, and Empire of the Wheel Friends from Sonora. I first talk about NYMZA and the Sonora Aero Club and Dellschau, and this here, Origin. These are all at lulu.com. And again, you can see stuff I've written, empireofthewheel.blogspot.com, or you can hop in and join us at the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. If I have a couple of minutes and people have questions, I could take a couple of questions. That's up to Smiles there.
Hey, thank you, Walter. That's great. Very interesting talk as expected, and really so much to chew on. I first heard you talk about this. Of course, it turns out 5 years ago at the Secret Space Program, and you brought up some interesting thoughts on the switch over from the quote unquote more rational secret space discussion to what we have now dominating the UFO field, such as it is. I was going to see if I could grab some comments and questions. We definitely had one listener comment. Let me pull that up. Where to go? Adagreg says, I read the Secrets of Dellschau book and was quite impressed. Truly an interesting area. In fact, I was going to show, I think this is a book published by Anomalist Books, Anomalist Books being Patrick Quige and Dennis Stacy's publisher, who have been very supportive of the Anomaly Archives. We have every book from their catalog, 2 of everything actually, and we're happy to support them and see independent publishers like that, like Lulu, where you can get your material there. But some of the other comments I saw, let's see. I think there's some discussion about whether it was somebody else that actually was maybe the earliest, besides Ernst Zundel, introducing the Nazi angle, and that I think Red Pill was asking Aaron Gullius, another one of our presenters, Red Pill being another one of our presenters at the Streamathon in upcoming weeks, and another presenter, Twee, asking. You mentioned the German connection to your interpretation of the NYMZA name and what that might stand for.
I spell that out in the book, and I'm sorry, in the interest of time, I wasn't able to pull that up and read that out, but it is in my books, the Origin book, and in Empire of the Wheel 2, Friends from Sonora.
This is an interesting question, but if NYMZA people had already established roots in the U.S. by the 1850s, why would they need Operation Paperclip to return to the U.S.?
Because they weren't a unified Germany in the 1850s. The history answers that question. There wasn't a unified Germany till 1871, and they were focused on getting themselves established. And it was a different world, a different time, and just different circumstances. So that's why they're, Well,
there's a lot of positive comments about your presentation, and several folks talking about going and getting your books. And we're certainly we need to fill out our collection. We have Shimmering Light and another one of yours. I don't think we have Origin, which is like the one I'm really the most.
I'll send it to you. Make sure I get an address.
All right. We'll do that. Well, thank you so much, Walter, for your time and for this great presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for letting me be a part of this. I look forward to watching the rest of them too, myself, like everyone else. So.
No, good to sit back and enjoy the presentation. So,
okay,
have a great one.
Okay, you too. Thanks.
All right, folks. So, just a little house cleaning. We've got Paul Kimball up next, and we have, as you may have heard in the previous announcements, received a generous donation from somebody known to the Anomaly Archives, but who prefers to remain anonymous. And they have issued a challenge matching grant in the amount of $5,000. So we're right at, I believe, we're just about to break $1,000, and so we're on our way towards that $5,000. Which, if we get there, then we will be halfway to our total of $20,000 by getting that matching grant of $5,000. So I know so many of you have probably already given today. So whatever you are comfortable and capable of, we don't want to make people's lives any harder than they already are right now. But coming up in just a moment is going to be Paul Kimball. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.